last Friday, I-25F, had some time to kill before picking up my kids from school. It was a beautiful day, and I decided to take a drive down the back roads of my small hometown. As I was cruising along, I passed a man hitchhiking. He looked to be in his late 30s or early 40s, carrying a fishing pole and a backpack, seemingly innocent enough. I almost picked him up, but then I remembered the countless stories I'd heard about hitchhiking gone wrong. So I kept driving. But as I drove away, I began questioning my decision. What's the worst that could happen? I thought. My inner dialogue turned into guilt. I told myself, if he's still there when I loop back around, I'll pick him up. Sure enough, 10 minutes later, he was still standing there. I pulled over, though I was nervous. As soon as he got in, I knew I had made a mistake. He smelled awful and seemed off. It didn't help that he was eyeing me like I was his next meal. My hands were shaking when I tried to hand him a cigarette, but I tried to hide my nerves as I kept driving. His name was Wayne, and he lived just 5 minutes away from where I picked him up. He started talking about how he had lost his license due to DUIs and how he was living with an older man. He even tried to talk me into visiting him the next day. When I dropped him off at his destination, a shabby house surrounded by junk cars, he kept trying to get me to come inside with him. I firmly said no and drove away, relieved but a little shaken. I was proud that I'd faced my fear. On Monday, my instructor said, "Holy crap, someone was murdered on such and such road. Do you know anyone down that way?" I casually replied, I took a hitchhiker down that road on Friday. His name was Wayne, I think." Not long after, I saw Wayne's picture on Facebook, his face plastered all over the news. He'd been arrested for stabbing someone to death at the very house I had dropped him off at. The victim had bled out in that shack, and it turned out the old man Wayne had been living with didn't even exist. I swear I'll never pick up another hitchhiker again. When I was around 9 or 10 years old, I lived in the country. One summer evening, a bad accident happened just a couple of blocks from our farmhouse. We weren't home when it occurred, but we could see the aftermath when we returned later that night. The next day, curious about what had happened, I asked my mom if I could ride my bike to the corner where the accident took place. She agreed but warned me to stay close. We lived in a quiet, safe area, so I wasn't scared. I rode to the corner and started looking at the debris. While I was there, 2 men in a station wagon pulled up. From the moment they spoke to me, I felt an unsettling vibe. They asked, "Which one of us is cuter?" I didn't know what to say but knew I needed to get away fast. I jumped on my bike and started pedaling as fast as I could. I glanced back to see the car following me. My heart raced as I screamed for my mom. I could see her running towards me, and the moment the men saw her, they stopped and turned around, driving off. My mom called the police, but they couldn't do much. They took the details, but I'll never forget those men's faces. Every time I hear about someone being abducted, I think, that could have been me. It was one of the creepiest, most unexplainable things that has ever happened to me. I used to work as a security guard at the local port, doing overnight shifts. The port was huge, with a radius of nearly 2 miles, and at night, it was almost always deserted. Except for me and a few other guards, most of the port workers left at the end of the day, and only the safety officials stayed behind. There were 3 of us on a shift, me, Mike, and the lieutenant. Our main station was the front gate, the central hub for all the guards during the night. But sometimes we'd patrol other areas as well, just to make sure everything was secure. The veteran guards would often tell us stories about the port being haunted, about the accidents and deaths that had occurred over the years. They said the site had a dark history. Being religious, I didn't dismiss their warnings entirely, but I thought they were just trying to spook the new guys. I never believed much in ghosts or spirits, not until that night. For weeks, nothing strange happened, just a few odd creaks, misplaced objects every now and then during my patrols. But that all changed one night when Mike and I decided to hit the gym instead of playing racquetball. It was around 2:30 a.m., the place was dead silent, not even the hum of the air conditioning. The only sound was the steady buzz of the fluorescent lights. The gym was old, with a sauna, weights, and a racquetball court in the back. The walls of the court were thin plaster, and the thick glass doors allowed you to see inside. We were working out, trying to keep our energy up for the shift, when we heard a loud thump. We both froze, looking at each other, then shrugged it off. Maybe it was the lieutenant walking around or something. But after a few more minutes, the thump came again, louder this time. We were both on edge. I grabbed the radio, asking the lieutenant for his location. "Front gate," he replied. At this point, we were trying to make sense of it. Could it be the air conditioner? But no, it was off. And even when it was running during the day, we'd never heard anything like this. The thumps continued, one after the other, each sound more forceful than the last. By now, the tension was unbearable. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. We slowly approached the racquetball court, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. As we drew closer, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. My breath caught in my throat. When we turned the flashlight toward the glass door, a chill ran down my spine. There, in the middle of the court, was one of the balls, rolling slowly by itself. But here's the kicker. It wasn't just the ball moving. The loud thumps we'd been hearing were the ball being thrown against the walls, over and over, like someone was playing in there. But there was no one inside the court. No one. I couldn't explain it. My mind was racing, trying to come up with any logical reason, but there was nothing. This wasn't something we could just write off. We started backing away slowly, then, in a burst of panic, we turned and ran full speed back to the front gate. Our hearts were pounding in our chests, and I swear, I felt tears welling up in my eyes from fear. As we sprinted past the building, the lieutenant saw us and asked what the hell was going on. We were breathing hard, trying to catch our breath, and when we told him what we just witnessed, his face went pale. His expression didn't just show disbelief, it was more like he already knew what we were talking about. And that terrified me. "That's why there's always guards that quit often," he said, his voice low, almost as if he was trying to warn us. "There's something evil in that place. And it's not the first time something like this has happened." He took us to the office, where the security footage was playing. The screen flickered as dark, shadowy figures moved across the monitors. The lights in the building would turn on and off without anyone touching the switches. It was all happening right in front of us. Proof that what we'd seen wasn't just our imagination. There was something else at the port. Something we couldn't explain. That moment shattered everything I thought I knew about the world. I had never been so scared in my life. Whatever it was, whether a ghost, a demon, or something worse, I don't know. But I sure wasn't sticking around to find out. After that night, I couldn't bring myself to go back. And to this day, every time I think about it, I get chills. That place, there's something there. Something that doesn't want you to leave. This happened years ago, but it still haunts me. To this day, I still can't wrap my head around what happened in those woods. Maybe it was some kind of strange phenomenon, maybe we stumbled into a part of the forest that existed outside of time, but whatever it was, it's an experience that'll stay with me forever. I was a teenager, 16 or 17, and I'd been in scouting for most of my life. I loved exploring, hiking, and being in the woods with my friends. As I got older, I was trusted with more responsibilities, which made me feel both important and capable. One day, during a camping trip with a group of scouts, I was tasked with two other friends, Amy and Harriet, to head into the woods surrounding the campsite. The goal was simple: find a long, straight stick to carve into a point, like a spear or a staff for one of our activities. It seemed like a normal task, something we'd done countless times before. We set off from the campsite, walking together, chatting about random stuff, while trying to memorize the surroundings to make sure we didn't get lost. The woods were dense but familiar. The air was crisp and the ground beneath us was soft from recent rains, with a damp smell filling the air. Time seemed to stretch out effortlessly in those moments, and the task ahead felt easy enough. After what must have been 15 minutes of walking, we couldn't find the right stick. Nothing seemed quite right. No matter how hard we tried, the forest just didn't seem to give us what we needed. Frustrated, we decided to turn around and head back to camp. That's when the panic first set in. We had been walking in the same direction, making mental notes of the trees, the rock formations, the way the path twisted. But now, it was like the forest had closed in on us. The trees, once familiar, were now indistinguishable from one another. The air felt heavier, thicker. Everything had warped. The path we'd been on, there was no trace of it. It felt like the forest itself had swallowed it whole. I glanced at Amy and Harriet. They were both staring at the same thing. It was the same eerie feeling they must have been getting too, like the woods had shifted when we weren't looking. We shouted out for help, but our voices sounded small, muffled by the oppressive silence around us. We kept walking, but the trees were so close now, so dense, that it felt like we were being suffocated. It was as if the forest itself was alive, closing in on us, trying to prevent us from leaving. We stumbled through the trees, moving in what we thought was the right direction, but everything looked the same. I swear, some of the trees even started to look the same. The ones we had walked by just minutes ago had now become impossible to distinguish from each other. It was disorienting, like we were trapped in a loop. After what seemed like an eternity, we came to a thin concrete path that cut through the woods. It was out of place, like someone had laid it there, but it was too narrow to be an actual road. It ran between the trees, splitting the forest in two. Without thinking, we followed the path for a while, hoping it would lead to something familiar. But after a few hundred yards, we came across something else I never expected to see in these woods: a decrepit shack. It looked abandoned, like it hadn't been touched in years. A storage space? We had no idea. I felt the hairs on my neck rise as we walked past it. Something about the shack didn't sit right with me. It didn't belong here. But we kept going, drawn forward by the strange sense of direction the path gave us. We moved along until we reached a road. Not a hiking trail or something we recognized, but a real road. The kind that should have been far from the campsite. Before we could process this, a woman appeared. She was wearing a pink and purple regatta outdoors jacket, looking like she was out for a walk. She seemed perfectly normal, but in that moment, everything felt off. As we frantically asked her for directions back to our campsite, she looked at us with confusion. "I've never seen you before," she said, her voice calm but distant. She gestured toward the road behind her. "There's another campsite that way." We didn't question it. We were desperate. We followed her directions, hoping it would lead us back to safety. And eventually it did. After what felt like another long stretch of walking, we saw the familiar tents of our campsite in the distance, the campfire's light flickering warmly in the cool spring air. We rushed back to the group, out of breath and disoriented. The scout leader, Ian, saw us coming and immediately noticed something was off. He raised an eyebrow. "What happened? You were only gone for about 25 minutes. The rest of your free time is still going on." That's when the confusion really set in. We had been gone for at least an hour and a half, according to our watches and phones. The watches had synced, the phones showed the same time. How could we have been gone so long when Ian said it had only been 25 minutes? The forest had felt like it had swallowed us up, like time itself had changed while we were inside. We tried to explain what had happened, how the forest had closed in on us, how we'd found the shack in the road, how we'd walked for hours. But Ian just shook his head, thinking we had misjudged time somehow. The more we tried to explain, the stranger it seemed. To this day, we all still remember the feeling we had that day. The woods, the way everything felt wrong, like we'd stepped outside of the normal world. Like we had wandered into some other place where time didn't work the way it should. I can't help but wonder if we accidentally stumbled into a part of the forest that wasn't supposed to be found, or if we crossed a boundary that changed everything. Was it just a weird trick of the mind, or was it something more? I believe in the paranormal. This wasn't just a case of getting lost in the woods. No, it was far stranger than that. I think whatever happened out there, it wasn't us who had control of the situation. And I'll never forget that feeling, the sensation that we weren't meant to leave the woods. Don't miss out. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss more stories that will push the boundaries of what you believe to be real. What do you think might still be lurking in the shadows? Let's find out together.